Chapter 61, Embryo's Legacy 2. Ophelia smiled again. Then she sat down at her eye level, who was crying with a dejected expression, and said, "Uriah, look at me." She faced Ophelia, but she couldn't look at her in the face because of the tears on her face. "Oh my God, what shall I do?" Ophelia roughly wiped Uriah's face with a handkerchief. She then let her blow her nose. Slipping the 5 pebbles in her hands, Ophelia said, "Let me return them to you, but this time only. I won't next time, got it?" She spoke to Uriah sternly. Uriah couldn't even check the pebbles in her hand and kept bowing to her. "I'm sorry, I won't do it again. Is that all you want to say?" Uriah shook her head and bowed deeply to her. "Thank you. You're welcome," Ophelia, patting Uriah's hair happily, stood up. At that moment, Baduk made a miserable groaning, but Ophelia was stern. Actually, it was Baduk that held Uriah's hand and ran to the gambling room. "Here, I can't forgive you." Baduk again groaned miserably, but Ophelia wasn't persuaded. Instead of stroking Baduk's head, she hit it gently. "Go back quickly." Looking at the bones and chicken vouchers on the table, Baduk swallowed its tears. Baduk left the table bitterly, with Uriah pulling its hand hard. Yong-ho, who was waiting until the dust settled, let his shoulders droop and said, "What did you do to them?" "Well, I've taught them some lessons early on, because gambling is a shortcut to the ruin of one's family." "Hey, I don't want to remind you of this, but you remember who asked me to build this gambling house, right?" "Ah, you know it's me." Ophelia smiled refreshingly and went back to her seat. Indeed, she acted professionally like the former hostess of a tavern. 20 days had passed since Yong-ho was recognized by a loon. Yong-ho opened a bar and a gambling house on the first floor of the House of Mammon, as recommended by Ophelia. The space was more than enough, because some of the major facilities, including the Demon King's room, was moved to the first floor of the Labyrinth of Greed. News of the war between the kings in the northern area was also delivered to the southern area. But the fighting there was too far from the south. As he planned for the first time, Yong-ho took care of things in nearby places one by one. As Ophelia predicted, refugees from the west began to rush into the southern area. Yong-ho had no problem in accepting them, because there was a sharp decrease in the population of the free city due to repeated wars. It was also not difficult to establish a new order, because the House of Mammon became incredibly stronger than before. Yong-ho no longer neglected the prey at his mercy. He began to retrieve them one by one. He sent dungeon spirits to the dungeon of the House of Abigail that Oros had refurbished before his death. He wanted to reactivate the silver mine, which was the source of the Abigail family. Yong-ho also cracked down on the runaway soldiers hiding in the western area. He crashed some of them, but absorbed others to join them in the unit led by Tigrius, with Skull and Rikum reinforcing them. Now, Yong-ho thought he had a good many troops, with half the Skull unit and the newly established Black Orc Squadron. He made the decision when he bought nearly 200 skeleton workers. He now aggressively used the power of evolution. By evolving the existing Orc troops, he turned them into powerful, heavy infantry. The reason Yong-ho sent Rikum to the west, despite his position as the garrison captain, was because he wanted to have Rikum gain evolution EXP. Yong-ho had no intention of wasting the resources of the existing dungeon spirits. "I guess Baduk has become stronger than before by now." Come to think of it, Baduk went through a good many evolutions. Maybe it was stronger than he thought. "What are you thinking about now?" "Well, the eastern area. The Eastern Army was strong enough to occupy the northern area. Now was the time for them to return to their territory in the east." Yong-ho had no intention of striking them first. He thought it was better to realign and strengthen his troops instead. Of course, he toyed with that idea on the assumption that the Eastern Army would return quietly without making any further trouble. If they showed any sign of attacking the southern area, he would choose to attack rather than defend. "I think I have to tell our guys who went to the west to come back," said Ophelia. He nodded. The reason he needed them back wasn't just to prepare for the attack by the Eastern Army. He needed Skull and Tigrius to attack the 4th floor of the Labyrinth of Greed. The arena too. At that moment he suddenly straightened and took out a purple marble slightly smaller than his fist from his pocket. It was a long-distance communication device he received as a reward for challenging the 15th floor of the arena. "You're no gentleman," Ophelia quipped. Yong-ho smiled at her and activated the device. As if to verify his gift from the arena, the device nicely connected him to his dungeon spirits, even though they were far from him. Tigrius of the House of Randalt is honored to see the master of the great House of Mammon. Tigrius' voice, mixed with a bit of noise, came from the marble. Strange rumors are circulating in the north and west. Rumor. Are you talking about other rumors than our master's defeat of Embryo? Ophelia asked, squinting her eyes. Tigrius replied immediately over the marble device. Well, the rumor itself is about our master and Embryo, but the problem is the substance of the rumor. Isthmus. There are conflicting rumors about the fighting between our master and Embryo. One of them is really true, while the other one has been distorted a lot. In particular, they are divided about the bone dragon. What Tigrius said was somewhat strange about the bone dragon, Yong-ho thought. It is not the bone dragon that Embryo mobilized, it's just a wyvern that's a little bit huge. What Tigrius briefed him was fairly accurate. Tigrius continued. The mobilized force, or the aspect of the fight they are talking about, is also very different from the truth. If we only believe in the distorted rumors, the victory of the House of Mammon this time was not a miracle, but a battle that can be won sufficiently, depending on the tactics. First of all, the number of our troops was exaggerated. As for the aspect of the fight, they are speculating that our master's forces were inferior to Embryo's forces numerically, but ambushed and defeated them by pure luck. Anyway, the fact that Yong-ho won by surprise attack was the same. However, even with the same victory, the potential of Yong-ho and the House of Mammon could be evaluated differently since the way he won was different. Particularly, the way they mistook the bone dragon for a giant wyvern bothered Yong-ho. If only dozens of troops penetrated Embryo's forces and won, it meant that Yong-ho's combat power was excellent. If there was one general who can confront hundreds of soldiers alone, and the other one who leads hundreds of troops and defeats 1,000 troops, which general was more threatening? Aside from other factors, definitely, the former was more threatening in the demon world where the Superman exists. What is the source of the rumors? Those who claim they are survivors of the battle that day are responsible for the rumors. Suisi. I'm sorry to say this, but it seems difficult to find the specific source because all kinds of rumors are getting around now. It wasn't Tigrius' fault. Rumors were supposed to be spreading like that. Once they began to spread, it was not easy to control them or find out those who spread them initially. For this reason, Yong-ho thought of something more fundamental than the source of the rumors. Why were these rumors getting around? Who would benefit from these rumors? At last, Ophelia opened her mouth. Which rumors do you think are more true? You put more weight on the latter, right? Exactly. Right now, they are distorting the truth. It seems that Embryo's runaway soldiers are engaged in a disinformation campaign to make excuses for their defeat. It was as Yong-ho expected, Ophelia said. Well, people come to believe more of what they want to believe. In fact, the fight between our master and Embryo was too big to start in the southern area. As a result, those who haven't seen the fight directly naturally tend to believe false or exaggerated episodes or rumors. She generalized about the fighting. But this kind of generalization could not explain everything, she continued. But even if we take those factors into account, the current situation is strange now. There are too many survivors of the day for this kind of false rumor to be mistaken as true. It's not easy for false rumors to replace the truth, like now, even if only a couple of survivors spread the rumors. Do you think somebody is engaged in organized manipulation? I think it's reasonable to think so. The mastermind behind the rumors, who could exercise organizational power. What came to his mind immediately was kings. From a commonsensical point of view, it didn't make sense for them to put lots of effort into the deserted southern land. However, Yong-ho had no choice but to doubt them because he remembered Embryo's warning. But what kind of benefits can they take? Which benefit could they take from the distorted rumors about the alleged underestimated power of the House of Mammon? Both Ophelia and Tigrius were silent. It was clear that they had the same doubts as Yong-ho. When they kept silent for long, somebody cut in suddenly. Master, I've got reports from the dungeon meerkats. Frist? A group of unidentified wolves is approaching the entrance of the dungeon. It was Lucius' report, Yong-ho said immediately. Tigrius, get your troops back and come back to the southern area. I'll get back to you in a few hours. Yes, master, I'll follow your order. His communication with Tigrius was lost. He put the marble device into his pocket and went out of the gambling room with Ophelia. He also summoned Catalina and Aligos through Lucia. A flock of wolves. What came to his mind at the moment was just one name. Chapter 62, Embryo's Legacy 3, The Dungeon Meerkats, which became quite a large family by having babies, shuddered. It was because of a herd of wolves roaming about 30 meters from the dungeon entrance. The wolves did not act threateningly, much bigger than ordinary wolves. They were silent. Without making any sound, they just looked at the entrance to the dungeon in the House of Mammon. They also remained silent even when the dungeon entrance was opened. Embryo, the demon king of wolves. The reason he was called that was because he was with a herd of wolves anytime, anywhere. However, Yong-ho had never seen a herd of Embryo's wolves. Even the moment Embryo was fighting Yong-ho desperately, he didn't see the wolves. These wolves were away from Embryo until now. Why weren't they in that place on that day when Embryo was engaged in deadly fighting? Were they staying out of the battlefield at Embryo's order? Since Yong-ho was silent, his dungeon spirits didn't act recklessly. Only Catalina was ready for the fighting by raising the blade of black mana. It was the wolves that moved first. They were now split into two groups. A grey wolf stepped up through the gap between them. It was especially a bigger wolf. It was so high that it almost touched a person's chest. It slowly approached Yong-ho with its head slightly down, as if to show that it wasn't hostile toward him. Yong-ho watched it quietly. And finally, the distance between Yong-ho and the wolf was narrowed to none. Standing right in front of Yong-ho, it raised its head high to reveal the necklace hidden in its fur. There was a red jewel at the end of the black belt, jewelry for saving information. This is a storage medium into which memories or images can be inserted. Lucia said it because she was right in front of the entrance. Yong-ho carefully reached out and unwrapped the wolf's necklace. He held the jewel in his hand and tried to inject mana on it. Light was emitted from the gem. It was like a beam projector. The light gathered in the air and took the shape of a translucent humanoid like a loon that he had seen on the third floor of the Labyrinth of Greed. It was what both Yong-ho and all of the dungeon spirits expected. I am Embryo. Bye. If this video is being played by somebody here now, it means I'm already dead. And someone here killed me. It was different from a loon. It was simply playing the saved video. Yong-ho recalled Mammon that he had encountered in the human world, the one who killed me. The one I recognized as the new head of the herd. You may think I am meddling too much if I go to the trouble of leaving this data behind, but if the one who killed me was the same one I thought of, he would need this data. As someone who talked about his own death, Embryo spoke too calmly. In fact, it was natural. Embryo never thought that this video would actually be used like this. The reason he made this video was because he wanted to prepare for the new head of the wolves. He just prepared it for contingencies. He took a deep breath and said, I was making a deal with the king of gluttony, Trox. According to the deal, he would support me with reinforcements and I would use them to unify the southern area. It was a simple and clear deal. The hypothesis Yong-ho assumed the other day was correct. Ophelia suddenly stared at the dungeon meerkats that had been gathered at the entrance of the dungeon. Some of the quick-witted parents moved quickly for fear that their babies would fall on their buttocks. After taking the babies, they dug into the burrow. Some of them were running, covering their ears with their hands as if they couldn't hear anything. Embryo continued. The king of gluttony was planning to rule the southern area after promoting me as a puppet, and I wanted to become a new king after unifying the southern area. Then he made a self-mocking smile, because his plan was just reckless. As our intention was contradictory, the deal broke down as a disaster. Well, we used each other in a sense. The reason why the king of gluttony went to the trouble of using me was because of other kings. As the one who killed me, you also know that the 6 kings are currently enjoying peace by holding each other in check. In other words, they don't want any of them to be unusually stronger. There were not 3, but 6 kings who had similar power and forces. Whatever the condition of their real abilities, that was the current situation where they were in, and they enjoyed peace through mutual check and balance for over 100 years. If I died without unifying the southern area, it means that the king of gluttony also failed. He would not promote any puppet right now, because it's too unnatural for any strongman to appear immediately after me. Perhaps he would leave the southern area vacant for several years. But if the one who killed me wasn't just an ordinary master in the southern area, the king of gluttony would move, and aggressively at that. He will move not to obtain the southern area, but to overthrow you who killed me. The king's move was worth it because Yong-ho had more value than the entire southern area. Ophelia opened her mouth and blurted out, "That's why they downsized the rumors about the battle between you and our master, so that other kings could not notice our master's extraordinariness. It was because the king of gluttony had to monopolize it and hog the treasure. It is unlikely for the king of gluttony to raise up a great army. He will move in secret. Maybe he will visit your dungeon in person so that other kings won't notice that he has overthrown you." That was the way the king of gluttony did things. He never had his possessions taken away. He was always ready to dive into the mud for whatever he wanted. Rumors were circulating in the north and west. The king of gluttony was already on the move. Embryo was silent for a moment. After moving up and down his lips as if to try to calm down, he continued, "Maybe there is still some time for you to prepare. T.S. Barisi. If you are not ordinary, as I think, and if you are the man who has the sin of greed that has disappeared in the demon world since that great mammon." His words were mixed with self-mock and arrogance. He smiled at his conviction that he himself would not be killed in a southern area by someone who committed no sin. In the end, the fact that he had no greed made him mock himself. Embryo smiled very little. It was his first and last smile for Yong-ho. "It's an area of possibilities, but I probably would not have died alone. I would have made the Watcher placed by the king of gluttony my fellow traveler. The killing of the Watcher will give you some time. Maybe because of the Watcher's death, the king of gluttony might not have exact information about you. Then you can buy more time, at least 3 or 4 months after my death, or even half a year. If you're lucky, it could be years before the king of gluttony attacks you." Embryo took a deep breath. This video wasn't made just before he died. Rather, it had been made much earlier. Embryo had thought he might be defeated. In the end, he did not turn away from the future when he could not be a king. So he confessed, but he didn't reveal his innermost intentions. He didn't even reveal it right before he died. He didn't need to babble about the reason why he wanted to be a king, or tell about his past in the video left behind in case of his death. Embryo, the man who wanted to become a king, regained his composure. Then he spoke to the old him. "Let me keep everything I know about the king of gluttony in this duel. You will find this very helpful because I have prepared it in case you will have to confront him one day." Embryo didn't hate the king of gluttony that much. Rather, he liked the king. He was a man with cunning and courage that befitted his ambition. Since he had the patience enough to wait for the right time and the composure that was not easily shaken, he could be called truly an ideal monarch. Nonetheless, Embryo wanted to take the side of the one who killed him rather than the king of gluttony, for the one who killed him would be the very one Embryo himself really wanted to be. Even if he committed no sin, the one who killed him would dream of becoming a king, with the southern area as his base. I doubt if you will use this video actually. I think I was too much into it. Honestly, I went a bit too far because the one who killed me may not have the sin. Maybe he might be killed by a sword for no reason. If you consider the current situation in the southern area, it could really happen. But I've already taken the video. Even if it will never be put to use forever, I think I have to wrap it up properly because this video is for the one that I will recognize as the leader. Embryo refined his expression again, as he himself said. He was absorbed in it and wanted the position of the king of greed. He put his whole heart into it. If you who killed me is truly the king of greed, if you are the one I have longed for. Embryo slowly closed and opened his eyes. He made a request to the new leader lastly. Be prepared. The king of gluttony will visit you. Embryo's figure was scattered in the air. Eligos, who was tense, gulped, and Catalina curled her lips. Ophelia closed her eyes tightly. The king of gluttony. One of the 6 existing kings he was coming. Chapter 123. Im yours 1. Embryo was dead. He did not exist anymore. However, just before he died, he chose Yong-ho as the new head of the herd of wolves, the wolf leading the herd leader, the man who was responsible for the preservation of the herd. It was common for the one who defeated the head of a group to become their new head. However, considering the preservation of the herd, Embryo's choice of Yong-ho was a bit strange. At the time he left behind the video, Embryo wasn't sure of his death or the existence of the King of Greed. But it was different right before he died. Embryo also knew that Yong-ho was the King of Greed. The King of Gluttony was about to mount an attack against Yong-ho, and it meant that the new head of the group would be once again faced with an extreme crisis. Nonetheless, Embryo chose Yong-ho. He entrusted the herd of wolves to the new King of Greed. In a way, his decision was natural. Embryo decisively characterized the King of Gluttony as an enemy in the video, prepared for the next leader to succeed him. He himself was thinking of fighting the King of Gluttony one day. The wolves dedicated their loyalty to Yong-ho, just as they did to Embryo. They didn't even howl, much less talk. But Yong-ho could feel it. To Yong-ho, they were a completely different kind of connection from the dungeon spirits. Yong-ho himself got connected with the dungeon spirits and soul. This was possible because the dungeon spirits dedicated both body and soul to Yong-ho. Yong-he didn't get directly connected with the herd of wolves in soul. It was like the members of the herd were connected to a mental network created by magic. Strong bond, exchange of opinion, sharing of senses. The herd of wolves was a group that had been around for hundreds of years. They were one of the several survival guides made by ancient shamans in order to survive in the demon world where the law of the jungle dominated. As the new leader of the herd, Yong-ho knew that fact. He could also faintly feel the moment Embryo became the herd leader. There were also some additional effects. His physical strength and endurance became stronger. A new sense that should be called wildness was added to his existing senses, and the ability to regenerate his body, which he did not have before, was also created. Of course, it was not a deceptive force like Embryo's superhuman ability to regenerate. It enabled Yong-ho to heal wounds 2 or 3 times faster. But this was enough. Yong-ho had a quick recovery rate thanks to his physical evolution. It was obvious that he would benefit from it during battle. Yong-ho gently accepted the herd of wolves. By doing so, he understood Embryo more deeply. He could read the traces Embryo left behind in the herd. It was Yuria who most welcomed the wolves as new members of Yong-ho's forces. She especially liked the grey wolf with its long fur and soft hair. Actually, the wolf was no. 2 in the herd in ranking. Baduk, who was deprived of Yuria all of a sudden, stared at the grey wolf's fur with a jealous expression. Yong-ho felt he would pay special attention to that part of Baduk at its next evolution. Yong-ho ordered Tigrius, Skull, and Raccoon to come back quickly. It would not be too late for him to mention the King of Gluttony after they arrive at the House of Mammon. I don't think the King of Gluttony will come here right away. Impositive about it. Yong-ho could feel anxiety in Ophelia's voice, who was always calm when she talked about intelligence. The King of Gluttony, one of the 6 kings who currently rule the demon world, carried gravitas befitting his name. Ophelia finally continued after moving up and down her lips several times. The war in the north will rather help us. Because of the unprecedented all-out war between the King of Pride and the King of Envy, all the other kings except the King of Sloth are showing signs of raising up their armies. The king with the power of sin and godly energy was also the most powerful weapon. Naturally, he got the most attention. Exposing the king's whereabouts itself was also a means of intimidating others. The King of Fury and the King of Gluttony were exposing their location. Because of this, it was more difficult for the King of Gluttony to be away from his place. The King of Gluttony won't be convinced yet that you have the sin of greed. So, he will need to verify any intelligence about your location. Embryo is right. You still have time. At least it will take several months for the king to make the move. So, you don't have to be impatient. You've got enough time to prepare. Ophelia began to speak faster as she approached Yong-ho. Although she was talking to Yong-ho, at the same time, she was talking to herself. Calm down. Do not be impatient. You still have time. Yong-ho nodded. It looks like he's in a hurry today. He seems to have something urgent. Chwiryong, seated in the special seat, said in a low voice. Amon also agreed. Yong-ho, fighting the floormaster on the 18th floor, was more hurried than usual. Yong-ho became strong very quickly. Thanks to greed and the power of evolution, he quickly increased mana and stamina. but he was basically excellent in fighting. He knew well how to fight. He found the shortcut to victory every time without being bound by a stereotype. Apart from that, he also had a talent for martial arts. Of course, he wasn't as good as Aemon or Elune. However, he was extraordinary. Although it was true that Aemon taught him how to use a spear, his spearmanship already surpassed the level that any ordinary man could reach in just half a year. The floor master on the 18th floor was one of the previous masters of the House of Mammon who belonged to the arena. His different name is the Demon King of Shadow. He mainly used a tactic of oppressing the enemy by using his shadow like an alter ego. Yong-ho was fully pressing the floor master of the 18th floor. His spear covered with the green flames tore the shadow with overwhelming power. Yong-ho would win after his 5th attack. Both Gusyeon and Amon thought so. Changing the way he was sitting, Gusyeon chewed the green grapes that Catalina brought. They were harvested from the Garden of Life. Did you say it is the king of gluttony that has our little master on edge? So, it seems to have nothing to do with the betrayers on that day, because gluttony was one of Mammon's sins. Mammon had greed, gluttony, and fury among the 7 deadly sins. It's definitely a big ordeal for our master. But if he overcomes it, he will get qualified to face the truth of that day. Gusyeon, Amon said in a little voice. Gusyeon didn't turn his head at Aemon's worried call. Instead, Gusyeon replied while looking into the air, "Don't worry, Amon. Too many years have passed since that day. I am not obsessed with revenge, as you might think. I just want to hand down the great achievements of Mammon to our little master." Gusyeon spoke with a bit of grunt. Aemon found himself empathizing with Gusyeon. Right at that moment, Yong-ho was done attacking for the 5th time, finally. After burning the floor master on the 18th floor, Yong-ho was delighted with the items from the reward box, not the victory itself. His face was very bright, as if he forgot all his worries about the king of gluttony. Chapter 64. I'm yours too. Aemon and Gusyeon turned to each other, then stood up at the same time. Well, I think I know what he will do next. He's going to summon somebody with that reward. Of course, it's Kaiwan. Unlike the one that he obtained after breaking through the 10th floor, this time, Yong-ho obtained only a 1-day minor summons with which he could summon a dungeon spirit from the arena, but it was enough for him. A smile was all over his face. Staring at him quietly, Amon asked earnestly, "Are you trying to increase your anguish?" Catalina opened her eyes wide, and Gusyeon admired making a face. Yong-ho said, "Nope, not at all. Then what are you going to do after summoning Kaiwan? And why are you summoning her?" The floor master on the 18th floor is also a former master of the House of Mammon. Gusyeon asked quite sharply, because Yong-ho sometimes mentioned this. "Kaiwan, if I can't summon another former master when I first wanted the summons, this is out of his anguish again." Amon was convinced. Gusyeon giggled, and Catalina pouted her lips. Yong-ho shook his head and said while shrugging his shoulders, "Well, you will know who I summon soon. See you again next time." Gusyeon Yong-ho looked around the stadium where Kaiwan and other former masters were sitting. He then headed straight for the exit. With Catalina hurriedly following Yong-ho, Amon turned to Gusyeon. Amon asked as if he was asking for consent, "I guess it must be anguish, right?" Gusyeon giggled once more. Instead of answering, he put a cigar in his mouth. As soon as Yong-ho left the arena, he didn't go far. After taking a seat in Kaiwan's lounge, he summoned through Lucia the remaining dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon Eligos, and Ophelia arrived in less than a few minutes. Both of them were sweaty as if they were sparring at the training ground. It was regrettable that Skull and Tigrius were not available, but it was inevitable. Yong-ho lined the 3, including Catalina, side by side, and he stood with his back 2 steps ahead of the 3. "Let me get started." Yong-ho tore the summons right away. Then, his manner was concentrated in the air. Kaiwan was summoned through the process that the dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon had already experienced. "So, you're gonna make your wish come true through me this time, right?" Standing obliquely, Kaiwan asked provocatively, but she stopped in no time because she was distracted by the familiar and nostalgic scene of her good old lounge. The lounge looked like the same one before she disappeared. She gulped at the moment. If she let her guard down here, she felt like she would cry, recalling her brother. It was a situation that Yong-ho didn't expect, but he had to control it. He grabbed her shoulder, then looked straight into her eyes, which were a little bit wet. When she seemed to calm down a bit, he said with a straight face, "Kaiwan, this is my wish. Sure, tell me whatever it is. I want you to be my dungeon spirit." "Good, what is it?" When she asked back, he already got down to work. On behalf of Yong-ho, Lucia proceeded to register her as a dungeon spirit. When he summoned Kaiwan last time, he noticed one difference. She was different when she was in the arena and outside the arena. To be precise, the arena's dominance over Kaiwan was different. Outside the arena, its dominance was weak, of course. A dungeon spirit belonged to the dungeon. A spirit in the arena belonged to the arena. If so, what would happen if a spirit in the arena was made a dungeon spirit? It was difficult inside the arena because the dominance of the arena was too strong. But what if Yong-ho weakened its dominance further by releasing tremendous mana? The magic field and brigada rings on his left arm and right hand respectively lit up. Not only Yong-ho, but also all the dungeon spirits erected their own horns and released mana. They did so, guided by Yong-ho. And now Ophelia and Eligos knew what he was going to do. Yong-ho literally poured out all his mana. He released much more mana than he did when he forcibly made Salami his dungeon spirit in the past. Lucia screamed, "All the stored mana in the dungeon has been released. Squeeds. Please stick it out well." "Master, Yong-ho is kind of a vehicle at the moment. Almost all the mana of the Mammon family, including that of Yong-ho himself and the dungeon spirits, was poured into Kaiwan through his body. At last, the arena's dominance was blocked instantly. Yong-ho and Kaiwan's souls were directly connected. Master Lucia hastily stopped releasing mana. Catalina, Eligos, and Ophelia collapsed or stepped back because of the repulsive force transmitted through their own brigada. Yong-ho released his hand from Kaiwan's shoulder. He stumbled while stepping back. Then he roared in no time. A new power was surging inside him. It was something he experienced every time he obtained a powerful dungeon spirit. Kaiwan had 4 horns. Because of this, it did not bring about innovative change to Yong-ho with 5 horns. However, it was never insignificant. Yong-ho felt that his mana was upgraded once more. What he wanted was not an increase in mana alone. The power of distortion. He felt it. His greed sensed a new power in him. By keeping Tigreus as his dungeon spirit, Yong-ho acquired the power of combination mana. With that power, he combined the power of life and death into one, and dealt a fatal blow to Embryo. It was the same this time, and this was the reason why he chose Kaiwan as his dungeon spirit, the floor master on the 18th floor. The power of the shadow he used did not benefit Yong-ho. He could do as much by using Catalina's black mana. By acquiring Kaiwan, however, he could gain the power of distortion called the Absolute Shield. Catalina, Ophelia, and Eligos also began to roar. Since Yong-ho, their master, became stronger, they also experienced growth as well. And at this moment, there was another one that was growing. Kaiwan wrapped her own shoulder. She screamed, sprinkling red light from her eyes. A 5th horn rose from the middle of her forehead. The moment she crossed the wall that had been tightly blocked for decades, Kaiwan felt she became completely new. And when it was all over, everyone in the room was gasping for breath, but they were all smiling. Yong-ho clenched his fist. His growth now had proven everything. He hijacked Kaiwan from the arena, and he succeeded in growing stronger, along with his dungeon spirits. Kaiwan smiled brightly. Indeed, she felt liberated from the arena after decades. The unpleasant senses that always dominated her soul disappeared. Instead, she had a new connection to Yong-ho. She was happy. She was never offended. Rather, she felt faithful satisfaction. Kaiwan licked her lower lip once. With joy in her ferocious eyes, she approached Yong-ho and whispered gently, "My master. You're the one that I have to give all my body and soul." Kaiwan. He was embarrassed, but she was calm. She hugged his neck and kissed Yong-ho. Although it was short, her kiss was much more passionate than before. She withdrew her lips from his. He looked at her blankly, and she laughed mischievously as if to provoke everyone around her. "I am now yours." She winked at him after saying that. In terms of the nuance of her words, it looked like Yong-ho became her dungeon spirit, and the one watching this scene in the back nodded alone. Then he said in an inaudible voice, It's the power of his anguish again. Ayamon smiled gently. Chapter 65. Overwhelming Power 1. A week had passed since Kaiwan joined them as a dungeon spirit. She proved herself competent by actions, not words. Moreover, she showed her competence not in combat, but in other areas. Even at a glance, the dungeon has grown so big suddenly. I think I have to take care of lots of stuff in it. In fact, she was once the master of the House of Mammon, before she was a powerful spirit of the arena. She was the legendary master that transformed the House of Mammon on the verge of collapse into a powerful one that other masters were afraid of. Accordingly, her know-how about dungeon management was unrivaled, dwarfing Young Ho. She had as many as 10 years of experience in managing a dungeon. Moreover, she was extremely efficient. She served as the master in a harsh environment where she could not waste even small resources. Any items that would be considered trash to others were valuable resources for a great use. Ophelia also admired the way she took care of her work flawlessly. Ophelia was also a pretty good manager, but a dungeon was different from a tavern. Obviously, the way Kaiwan managed the dungeon was more efficient. Young Ho humbly accepted this unexpected result, honoring his father's advice that the president didn't have to be an expert, which his father used to tell him when he went out for chicken delivery. He had Kaiwan a de facto dungeon manager. In his opinion, he felt he made a good decision on it. Kaiwan was his dungeon spirit, so he didn't need to worry about her betrayal. 1 week passed. Young Ho, who welcomed back Skull, Tigrius, and Rickham, who returned from the western area, held a conference in which all the key members of the Mammon family participated. The meeting place was the room with the Demon King, which had been moved to the first floor of the Labyrinth of Greed. On the left and right of the large table in front of the throne were the vassals of the Mammon family. Right next to his right side was Eligos, the butler, and Ophelia, the manager of the Free City. And next to them were Tigrius, the manager of the Randall dungeon, and Rikum, the garrison commander of the House of Mammon, and Bergrim, the chief of the workshop. Young Ho looked to the left. Catalina and Kaiwan were seated nearest to him, with her long ears drooping. Catalina was at a loss what to do, and Kaiwan was gently hugging her as if she was so cute. It was a familiar scene for Young Ho. Before he knew it, he recalled Elun and Citri that he had seen in his memories of the House of Mammon. He smiled bitterly and rolled his eyes when he also recalled Ophelius, reminder that he was the Demon King. Seeing Catalina and Skull next to her, he felt relaxed somehow. He did not mention the impending threat of the King of Gluttony, the most important issue at the moment, because it was something he would not forget, let alone one that he would keep in mind all the time. He felt those dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon, not those under his direct control, had better not know about it. I think it is the most important thing to increase the dungeon's soul, namely Lucius' control, in order to take over the 4th floor, our new target. It was Kaiwan who first presented her opinion. Normally, she talked informally to Young Ho, but in a public place like this, she always used honorifics. The 4th floor of the Labyrinth of Greed among Mammons, 12 spirits, 8-handed Baruna, which was Cancer, passed away a long time ago like Ilune. Besides, she did not leave her surrogate behind like Elun because of this. Young Ho could take her recognition for free, like Skathak said, but it wasn't necessarily good for him. Since he didn't get Baruna's recognition through a legitimate process, he could make his godly energy near perfect, but he could not properly use her power. The power of 8-handed Baruna was that of creation. According to Skathak, Baruna used the power of creation to work miracles, such as creating something from almost nothing. It was the power befitting the builder of the Labyrinth of Greed. When a dungeon spirit to succeed Baruna's position emerged someday, she would be able to revive the power of creation again, just like Skull and Catalina succeeded Baphomet's death and Elun's justice respectively. Because of this, Young Ho could put aside his lingering affection for the power of creation for now. The reason Kaiwan emphasized the need to take control of the 4th floor of the Labyrinth of Greed was because of the facilities there. The 4th floor of the Labyrinth of Greed was a workshop. Moreover, it was truly huge. Since it was a semi-automated factory, it was possible to mass-produce high-quality equipment as long as there were enough materials. The facilities on the 4th floor are amazing. If you can use those facilities, I bet you can make weapons that are several times better than now. It will be possible to produce traps that are more powerful than the existing ones. There are lots of blueprints left behind. Bergrim wrote down those sentences on the board in an enthusiastic handwriting style. His eyes were shining as if he was very excited, but it didn't last long. Recalling the problems that engineers faced all the time, Bergrim presented his own opinion timidly. If you can increase the budget and the amount of essence a little more. Yong-ho couldn't answer immediately, so he heard the opinions of the next dungeon spirit. This time, Rickham said, we need to purchase additional battle wagons and various equipment. If we can add specialized troops, such as large-sized warrior horses for transportation, we can greatly increase our military strength. In fact, when very powerful masters started a war, they usually deployed various kinds of dungeon spirits. For example, a mountain giant, which played the role of a turret by throwing huge rocks, a giant golem that could be called a tank itself, or a large flying spirit that could carry dozens or more at a time. Although Yong-ho had the power of evolution, it was difficult for him to raise large-sized spirits in a short time. This matter was a little different from training the skeletons that made up the skull unit. Instead of answering immediately, Yong-ho heard another dungeon spirit's opinion. Elagos said a little timidly, "It would be nice if we can add a working golem to the silver mine in the dungeon of the Abigail family." He used the expression, "it would be nice" instead of "it is necessary." It was because he took into account the fact that Yong-ho would need a significant budget to handle the requests that they already made. Yong-ho finally looked at Skull. Skull also presented its opinion with a sincere voice. Skull. It's necessary to obtain essence to grow Lucia. Besides, the budget and resources to make equipment and improve dungeons were insufficient. Yong-ho nodded at Skull's message. Other dungeon spirits didn't make the mistake of asking him what Skull just said to him. Yong-ho knew he had a way to solve all these problems at once. Although his action plan was different from the original one he had in mind, he had to change it, because the situation changed. At first, he thought it was the best way to attack the arena and the Labyrinth of Greed, but it wasn't. Since the price for it was fascinating, the risk was also big, so it took a considerable amount of time to attack the two places. Where could he confront the King of Gluttony and his soldiers? The location should be a dungeon. Even at the risk of damage, this time he needed to fight in the dungeon of the House of Mammon. And Yong-ho was thinking of using not only the House of Mammon, but also the Labyrinth of Greed. A demon king was the strongest when he fought in his own dungeon. He could use the mana of the dungeon through dungeon souls, and he could make use of the geographical advantages available through various traps installed in the dungeon. So, Yong-ho needed to get ready to fight in the dungeon. To do that, he needed to refurbish the dungeon. There was only one way for him to get both the budget for a stronger dungeon, as well as the experience of the dungeon spirits in a short time. Yong-ho said briefly and clearly, "We're going to attack the eastern area." Stravadi, one of the two masters that divided the eastern area, claimed to be a strategist. He was a Nagaraja with a snake's eyes and heart. Just like any Nagaraja, Stravadi was cool. His brave decision to divide the eastern area was motivated by his cold-heartedness. Through his expedition to the north, Stravadi strengthened his friendship with his rival and his most powerful ally, Sargatanas. Sargatanas was no longer a stranger to him. He was the husband of Stravadi's only daughter, and the heir to inherit everything from Stravadi one day. The eastern area was no longer two, it was one. Besides, he obtained a huge amount of loot in the process of occupying the northern area. He also took the essence of the northern masters to his heart's content. Embryo died, and the western and northern areas were devastated. Agales, who ran wildly in the areas, was not seen any longer. But there was only one problem. It was the House of Mammon in the south. It was a very simple situation. If he defeated the master of the House of Mammon, there would be no enemies in the southern area. It was also possible to unify the area for the first time since that great Mammon. However, there was one thing that made him anxious. He could not evaluate the power of the House of Mammon properly. He kept an eye on the clash between Embryo and the Mammon family. Of course, he had secretly dispatched a spy to monitor their fighting and report back. He wanted to find out how much damage Embryo would suffer. However, the spy did not return. To his embarrassment, all of the spies he dispatched were entangled in the battle and lost their lives. Chapter 66. Overwhelming Power 2. Since Stravadi did not know that the bone dragon's broad breath burned the spies, he had no way of knowing the exact situation, which made him very frustrated. After all, Stravadi was forced to put together all the intelligence and rumors available to make an educated guess. Since there were many survivors of Embryo's army, it was not difficult for him to gather some information. However, there was also a problem here. Totally contradictory rumors were spreading among the people. Which rumor should he believe? Should he trust the ridiculous rumor, assuming the worst scenario? Or should he trust the more commonsensical and reasonable rumor that lots of people were now believing? Rumors about the bone dragon just don't make any sense. If Embryo had such a card, why didn't he use it in his attack of the Western area? Embryo struggled very hard in his fight against the Western Masters Alliance. He had to spend as many as several months to defeat the Western Masters Alliance. Besides, he had to use the extreme military method to destroy most of the dungeons and the city in the Western area. What would have happened if Embryo had turned to the Bone Dragon in his fight against the Western Masters Alliance? If so, the situation would have been completely different, and the Western Masters Alliance would have been devastated much earlier, and there was a decisive problem from the beginning. Nobody could buy monsters like the Bone Dragon just because they had money. Did Embryo buy the Bone Dragon with all the money he collected from the occupied northern and western areas, from whom at the dungeon market? To purchase a Bone Dragon there, they had to go through the auction process. Those who could purchase this kind of monster without an auction were extremely limited, and of course, Embryo was not included in that limited number. Considering other elements of the rumor except for the Bone Dragon, the rumors that a wyvern appeared in Embryo's fight were more reliable. Stravadi watched closely the Mammon family's expedition to the western area, although he was not sure of the exact situation because he got the intelligence from his moles. The number of skeleton soldiers and warriors exceeded 100, getting close to 200. Examining the rumors about the Bone Dragon, the forces of the House of Mammon were utterly shabby, given that Embryo devastated the western area, and that there were so many survivors of Embryo's army that the Mammon family could not acquire lots of loot even after the victory. It was also unlikely that they bought new undead monsters after the battle. There were too many undead monsters for that. Because of this, Stravadi estimated the strength of the House of Mammon based on the rumors involving the wyvern, not the Bone Dragon. As always, he made a rational judgment, but the guy beat Embryo. No matter which rumor he believed, he had to admit it. Embryo was a monster that smashed the Western Masters Alliance by himself. Given that he absorbed all the essences of the defeated masters there, it was reasonable to think that Embryo had 5 horns. Let me assume that even the master of the House of Mammon has also 5 horns. Since he defeated Embryo, it's certain he absorbed his essence. Stravadi closed his eyes. He kept it in mind that the upcoming battle would not be a combat between the masters, but a war involving the mobilization of the army. After all, even a 5-horned master was made of bone and flesh. This meant that he could be ambushed and killed by a sword any time. Let me reduce the variables. If my own forces are not enough, let me get some help outside. He had no enemies other than the House of Mammon. Even if he squandered all his financial resources in the eastern area, it would be okay if he won, for he would obtain the whole southern area anyway. Bought by a sudden optimism, Stravadi looked at the map of the battlefield. The troops of the House of Mammon were marching toward the east. Hey, Yong-ho, do you know something like Najibamjo, win in the day but lose in the night? He cleared his throat when Kaiwan's voice transmitted through the communication device on his neck. What the heck was she talking about now? Apart from its meaning, was there such a word in the demon world? Me too. I want to do Najibamjo too. Catalina also said quickly, pricking her ears at Kaiwan's voice. He cooled the heat on his face with a fan. Obviously, Catalina didn't know what it meant, but she was pretty much conscious of Kaiwan now. He stroked her hair and said over the device, "Stop the nonsense and watch out for your surroundings well. Our master is watching me anyway from above. I trust you, so I hope I'm in your great hands." Laughing cheerfully, Kaiwan cut off the communication. It was good for him to see him cheerful, but he was embarrassed at the time because she was so different from when she was the former master. But this might be her real image, Yong-ho thought. If she had not become the master of a crumbling family at an early age, her eyes might have been gentle rather than ferocious like now. 4 days after Yong-ho made the decision to storm into the eastern area, the troops of the House of Mammon, led by the Skull Unit, were advancing smoothly toward the east. There were not so many troops mobilized. The main forces consisted of 250 members of the Skull Unit and 100 members of the Black Hawk Unit, and the rest were some transport units and about 200 other troops serving as escorts and reserves for the transportation unit. Since about half of the troops were the undead who did not need meals, the cargo of the transport unit was very light compared to the size of the unit. As the number of troops mobilized was small, they had to rely on the power of the commanders, so all the dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon were mobilized. Again this time, Eligos, who was confused about his identity as the butler or the assault leader these days, took command of the first independent task force with Ophelia. Unlike its impressive name, the task force consisted of only two, namely Eligos and Ophelia. Skull and Rickham commanded the Skull and Black Orc squadrons respectively, while Tigrius was responsible for the transportation unit in the rear. Kaiwan, the leader and only member of the second independent task force, ran a horse beside Skull. She had served as the master for many years, but she had rarely commanded large-scale troops, so her fighting alone like Eligos or Ophelia was more efficient. Salami, carrying Yong-ho and Catalina, fluttered its wings high in the sky. Since Salami wasn't simply evolved but promoted to Fire Elemental Dragon, it was quite different from before. First of all, it got bigger, and its wings and tail also got longer. Its head, that looked like a lizard or a salamander in the past, was added with a hard shell, which made it look like a dragon a lot. But Salami was still Salami. Its handle on the back was still the same, and the way it shook its head after listening to the conversation among Yong-ho, Catalina, and Kaiwan was the same. The reason that Yong-ho was on Salami's back in the sky was not simply to play the role of a vanguard. It wasn't only the Eastern Army that he was concerned about. What concerned him was the minions of the King of Gluttony, who were tempted to manipulate rumors about him in the west and north. It was highly likely that they were hiding somewhere in the east and south to watch the fight. Since he'd already shown his strength in the fight against Embryo, he didn't think of being absent from the battle at all, but he had no intention of revealing all his strength fully to the enemies. Unlike the southern area, there were lots of huge, strange rocks, mountains, and canyons in the east. Because of this, he couldn't look far away even though he was overlooking from the sky. But if I think the other way, it meant that not only the place to fight the enemy, but also the place to hide his troops were too obvious. Using the communication device, Yong-ho ordered the dungeon spirits to be cautious because the shape of the strange rocks and bizarre stones in the surrounding area was unusual. A huge hill was blocking them in the front, and a forest and strange rocks were located on the left and right respectively. It was a terrain where hundreds or thousands of troops could easily hide if they put their mind to it. Salami also narrowed its eyes as if it noticed something. Kaiwan, who was riding a horse at the forefront, raised her hand and stopped Skull and the others. But Tigrius urged the transportation unit to quickly catch up with the main forces. The Eastern Army, ambushed on the hill in the front, appeared. A group of troops poured out from the forest on the left. Instead of rushing to Yong-ho's troops, they moved slowly as if to form a siege, trying to attack the transportation convoy and rear guards led by Tigrius. Yong-ho couldn't afford to count the number of the Eastern Army. Salami suddenly turned to the strange rocky area on the right. An earth-shaking rumble overwhelmed everything. Yong-ho also saw it. A huge monster that rushed recklessly as if to destroy the strange rocky area burst into an angry cry. Then it charged straight at Yong-ho's forces. Strivadi, sitting on a hill with his elite soldiers, smiled in satisfaction. Everything was going well, as planned. He could make the most of the battlefield in his favor, because the master of the Mammon family innocently marched his troops straight into the treacherous enemy terrain. Strivadi knew well how the master of the Mammon family fought Agares. It was a very clever and wonderful operation that the master deployed a landworm into the battlefield and confused Agares' forces. Chapter 17, Overwhelming Power 3. So, Strivadi used the same strategy. He called a more heinous and terrible beast into the battlefield than the landworm, Chimera. It was a terrible monster that lived in the east since long ago. This beast, which had the body of a bear with scales on its 3 heads, a lion, a griffon, and a drake. Its tail was a snake, which was huge and violent, with its shoulders nearly 10 meters tall, A chimera could easily eat even a fully grown landworm at one gulp. Based on the standards of the dungeon market, it was a monster that would be ranked 5-star. It was a huge task for Stravati to wake up the chimera sleeping soundly in its nest for this battle. In order for the chimera to intrude at the right moment, he had to do some really meticulous calculations and sacrifice a large number of dungeon spirits. At the end of the day, he made it. All he had to do now was to wait for the outcome of the chimera's attack. He expected that the chimera would destroy the House of Mammon's troops completely. Of course, he didn't expect that the battle would be over with the chimera's attack alone. The moment the chimera was killed, he planned to advance his troops in the front line and in the rear. Then he would siege and annihilate the forces of the House of Mammon, who was severely wounded by chimera. Stravati's troops were numerically superior to Yong-ho's forces. The number of his troops in the front and in the rear was close to 2-0-0. By any standards, it was impossible that Stravati would be defeated in this battle. The chimera roared again. Not only Stravati, but also Sargatanas next to him laughed happily. The chimera, which was making an earth-shaking rumble, tore away Stravati's dungeon spirit that angered it. As if it was still upset, the chimera stared at the forces of the Mammon family stationed right in front of it. Excited, the chimera kicked the ground. Stravati clenched his fist. Then a huge storm of mana raged in front of them. It was a phenomenon that occurred as tremendous mana was opened simultaneously. A red beast jumped up toward the chimera that jumped into the air. The muscles of its red upper body covered with gray fur expanded as if it was bursting. Its fist, fully pulled, could be called a hammer. Something incredible happened. The red beast's fist struck the chimera's upper body hard. Hit by that punch, the chimera, which would weigh at least dozens of tons, was thrown down on the floor. The red beast that pulled its punch could not overcome the repulsion of his punch and bounce off into the sky. It was truly a Herculean punch beyond one's imagination. The beast's amazing attack did not end there. A woman with gray hair ran. As soon as the chimera hit the ground, she burst into a cheerful laughter and swung her whip sword. Like a snake that crept through the ground, her whip sword quickly wrapped around the lion-shaped chimera's neck. When the whip sword was released again, the chimera's flesh and blood covered the air. The chimera's neck, which had been severed to the extent that its bones were fully exposed, drooped and wobbled. There was one more red beast, much smaller and quicker than the first one. It soared into the air. Then it cut through the blood sprinkled by her whip sword. A lightning strike struck Griffon's head. Its power was also as mighty as a thunderbolt. One of Chimera's 3 heads was still intact. However, it did not dare to stand up. The red beast kicked Drake's head in succession, and the woman with gray hair wielded the whip sword to tear the snake's tail to pieces. The chimera couldn't devastate the main forces of the Mammon family. It didn't even approach them. With Yong-ho's main forces only 10 meters away, the chimera was almost dead and fell on the floor. It was impossible to imagine the beast of fear dominating the eastern area being mangled by another beast. Stravati's calculation proved wrong. He had to stop the operation now, father-in-law. Sargatanas urgently shouted. Startled, Stravati, who had been staring at the chimera blankly, looked straight ahead. Yong-ho's main forces were rushing toward his troops stationed down the hill Skullcove. A black beast that could not be called a horse anymore howled in anger. A skeleton knight with black armor on swung a long ivory hammer made with a spear. The energy of purple death arose like flames. Rush surround them. Sargatanas urgently cried. Stravati shook his head. He momentarily lost his mind because of the imposing posture of the rushing undead unit. Reasonably, it was right to form a siege. However, rationality did not exist on this battlefield. Skeleton troops charged toward them like a storm. They were too fast. Normal skeletons could not move as fast as them. Moreover, the convoy at the rear was also strange. Rather than preparing for the enemies in the rear, they quickly followed Yong-ho's main unit as if they were in a race. It seemed that they didn't even worry from the beginning that the mix of their friendly forces would result in the great confusion of their formation. Stravati again felt confused. But he soon understood that the irrational attack by the Mammon family's forces was actually based on rationality. The Eastern army, which collided with the skeleton unit, was literally smashed. The skeleton unit's combat power was unusually high. It was not just the strength of one black skeleton knight at the forefront. Anybody would believe it, even if the knight would be called Skeleton Warrior or even Skeleton Knight's army. It wasn't simply because of the power of evolution. There was something that Stravadi could not imagine in the overwhelming combat power of the Skull Unit's synchronization of power through the herd. Yong-ho paid attention to the mental network that Embryo's wolves formed among themselves. With the help of Tigrius and the wolves, he copied the network itself, then formed a new group network consisting of skull troops. Since the Skull Unit had a faint ego, Yong-ho could include more than 200 skulls in the group. Since Skull alone had to be responsible for almost all of the mana that maintained the group, it was worth the effort. First of all, Skull and its unit were in sync. The Skull Unit copied some of Skull's combat functions through the mental network and shared combat experiences with each other. The hardware itself was the same, but the software was literally revolutionized. Their combat power expanded rapidly. Skeleton soldiers were almost as good as a skeleton warrior, and the warrior equaled the knight. The skeleton knight and dragon soldiers also experienced their power expanding greatly. Moreover, as they shared experiences with each other, their accumulation of evolution EXP was several times faster than before. The Skull Unit devastated the Eastern Army. The Eastern Army collapsed, even before they, who got around the forest, could even attack the transportation unit, led by Tigrius, from behind. As things stood now, Stravadi's siege plan went nowhere. Moreover, the synchronized Skull forces showed a speedy movement that Stravadi could never imagine. The transportation unit led by Tigrius passed by the Skull Unit. They then disrupted the formation of the Eastern Army. With the Black Orc Unit, the Skull Unit turned. As if hundreds of them were merged into one, they changed the direction of the attack in unison. Then they made a dreadful reverse rush toward the Eastern Army that ran to complete the siege. While witnessing the crazy fighting scene, Stravadi did his job based on his reason. He realized that the Red Beast, a wild beast, and the gray-haired woman would soon join those crazy skeleton squads and go after the remaining Eastern Army. The Eastern Army was still numerically superior, several times as many as them. But Stravadi felt his numerical advantage was meaningless. He needed to do something powerful to turn the tide. Sargatanas, and he himself had to lead the reserve and join the fighting. The Eastern Masters commanding their units on the battlefield alone were not enough to defeat Yong-ho's forces. His reason told Stravadi that he himself and Sargatanas were strong because they had 5 horns after taking the essence of all the Northern Masters. So, you can make it. You can do it, Sargatanas shouted again. The moment he heard it, Stravadi realized one thing. There was one that he had to be most wary of among the Mammon family's forces. Nevertheless, he completely forgot this man because of what was going on before his eyes. Stravadi raised his head. He saw the sky. And right there the green sun was blazing down intensely. It blazed down towards Stravadi in his reserve. It was obviously big and intense. The moment the green sun hit the ground, the surrounding area turned into a superheated hell. Based on Yong-ho's standards, the current sun was smaller and weaker than the sun of the green flames he created in the fight against Embryo. It was because the absolute value of the time he gathered mana was only about 1/3 of the time, although he became stronger by using Kaiwan as his dungeon spirit. However, this kind of factor did not have a big impact on the situation. Stravadi's reserve army was burned. Stravadi fell into confusion amidst the green flames that engulfed everything in the surrounding area. The painful screaming of the soldiers, who were burned to death, tormented him. Stravadi instinctively released mana to drive away the green flames threatening to devour him. To protect himself from the heat, he created a curtain of mana. His mana with the attribute of chill not only repelled the green flames, but also calmed him down. Stravadi asked himself, is it possible for him to make an ideal retreat by realigning his troops in this situation? If he and Sargatanas join his forces, can they turn the tide? As soon as he thought it was impossible, Stravadi came up with the next plan rationally. The moment he devised it, Stravadi shouted, Sargatanas, yes, father-in-law. Chapter 168, Overwhelming Power 4. The chill embedded in his mana broke apart the green flames and opened the way. Stravadi saw Sargatanas defending himself by releasing mana just like himself. 5 horns were towering above the head of this purple-skinned giant. Given that his muscles were wriggling, it seemed that he was prepared for the fight. But Stravati thought he should not fight, so he reached out and grabbed Sagatana's instead of shouting at him, "We're going to retreat, father-in-law." Their eyes crossed. Sagatana's eyes trembled greatly. He was inflexible, but not stupid. He clearly understood why his father-in-law mentioned retreating. "We're going to desert the entire Eastern army on the battlefield. Only 2 of us will run away." Sagatana's opened his mouth wide at this sudden proposal. Although he could not persuade Stravati, a smooth talker and strategist, he wanted to say something. The total number of the Eastern Army soldiers on this battlefield exceeded 200. Dump them here. It was something he could not think of. He could not follow his father-in-law. Sagatana's stopped breathing for a moment. Stravati looked straight at him without saying anything. There was no more time. Stravati already began to feel the presence of the man with terrifying mana, the master of the House of Mammon, approaching him beyond the green flames. Sagatana's clenched his teeth. Stravati activated his power. Stravati's nickname was the Demon King of Jump. The 2 men jumped over the space and disappeared amid the green flames. Salami, trying to dive into the green flames while burning Stravati's reserve army, suddenly fluttered its wings again. Then it instantly changed its direction and increased altitude. Yongho also felt that Stravati and Sargatanas disappeared because Sargatanas' mana, who opened all his 5 horns, evaporated before his eyes. Yongho thought of several possibilities of his disappearance. He could have made a short-distance leap as Tigrius did in the past, or he could have simply hidden his mana and gone into hiding nearby. "I guess he has at least 5 horns. Yongho thought Sargatana's released mana very shortly. But Yongho was extremely good at detecting the opponent's mana. Given the size, color, and properties of the mana that arose among the green flames, it was clear that Sargatana's was a demon king with 5 horns. Just because one had the same number of horns, it did not mean that even the strength and weakness of the mana owner were the same, and the range of a mana's strength and weakness within the same number increased as the number of horns increased. Sargatana's mana was a little stronger or similar to that of Kaiwan, who barely produced 5 horns. Given that Stravati also had 5 horns, it wasn't easy for Yongho to deal with 2 demon kings with 5 horns. But, given his power as the master of the current House of Mammon, he could defeat Sargatana's and Stravati without any difficulty. It might be too hasty to judge the outcome even before Yongho had yet to confront the 2, but he thought so. Catalina, who was prepared to jump in the green flames and have it out with the 2 leaders of the Eastern Army, looked at Yongho curiously when Salami changed direction. In his right hand, he held a moonlight sword he inherited from Alun instead of the dagger he used until now. It was a silver sword that looked like a crescent moon. "It looks like the 2 ran away. Let's wrap up the fighting first." Yongho, who stroked Catalina's head, ordered Salami to turn back. Stravati had hundreds of reserves, and only a few of them were struck by the green sun. But Yongho didn't care anymore. Now that their main forces broke up, there was only one option for these soldiers who lost their commander. As Yongho expected, the reserve soldiers started running away instead of joining their main forces on the battlefield. They were living witnesses who would convey the overwhelming defeat of the Eastern Army everywhere. Salami fluttered its wings again. It squinted to see Bucephalus striding down the ground with Skull. Just as Salami was promoted to Fire Elemental Dragon, Bucephalus was also promoted to Nightmare Lord. With a mane made of green flames and a pitch-black body which was more than twice as large as a normal warhorse, Bucephalus was now powerful enough to dwarf the ordinary phantom steed, so much so that the Eastern Army soldiers were so scared of its glaring green eyes as to drop their weapons. Quietly watching Bucephalus fighting on the battlefield with its owner Skull, Salami nodded its head slowly. Looking at Bucephalus' glaring eyes, it seems Salami was quite satisfied with its fighting posture. There was a massacre, not a battle, happening on the battlefield. If the 2 large armies fought head-on, the death toll was surprisingly small, generally speaking. However, when the formation of any one army collapsed, it was a different story. Besides, when they started fleeing with their back against the other party, the number of their deaths increased dramatically from then on. That was why the loser in many of the historically famous battles incurred an enormous number of casualties compared to the winner. In other words, the army that lost its formation and ran away was just helpless against the opposing army's attack. The overwhelming destructive power of the Skull unit broke the formation of the Eastern Army from the front. Skull, teeming with Bucephalus to sprinkle death in all directions like Baphomet, was a disaster for the Eastern Army. However, it was because of Eligos, Ophelia, and Kaiwan joining them when they decisively smashed the formation of the Eastern Army. Out of the trio, especially Kaiwan, clearly knew what her role was on the battlefield. The general role of a general was to command his soldiers. However, the roles of the three dungeon spirits, named as Independent Task Force, were different. Kaiwan considered herself an assassin, rather a sniper. "It's time for you guys to be punished." Kaiwan's whip sword wrapped around the waist of a struggling Eastern Army commander. Even before he could resist her attack, she wielded the sword violently. He instantly fell on the ground. She swung the sword in succession, making him hit the ground several times. She fought very splendidly. Bursting into a thin and high-pitched laughter, she drew the attention of the Eastern Army soldiers. Her targets were simple: the one riding a horse, the one fighting well, the one shouting, the commander, and the one supporting with mana in the rear. In other words, she attacked only those who served as a sort of commanders who made numerous individual soldiers move as one group. It was much more beneficial to kill a single commander than defeating dozens of rank-and-file soldiers. Eligos, who made his brutal nature explode, could not control his anger precisely, but Ophelia didn't. Soon she understood Kaiwan's intentions and acted the same as she did. The absence of the commanders soon resulted in the collapse of the entire Eastern Army. Losing the will to fight, the Eastern Army soldiers began to run away, which soon led to the start of their massacre. The Eastern Army commander, who was thrown to the ground several times by Kaiwan, could not gather his senses. Fever came all over his body, as if all of his bones were broken. He could hardly exert his power because of extreme pain. Kaiwan approached him and withdrew her whipsword from him. Since it became clear who was the winner of the battle, she did not kill him thoughtlessly. She tapped his cheeks, who still didn't get back to his senses. "Let me save your life." Smiling brightly, she straightened and looked at the sky. Then she shook her hand toward Yong-ho, who was getting on Salami. Stravadi used his power in succession. If he was fully focused, he could jump up to 600 meters instantly. So, if he used it in a row, he could escape from Yong-ho as far as several kilometers in an instant. He used his power exactly 10 times. Landing on a strange rocky area about 6 km from the battlefield, he took a deep breath, gasping for breath. Depending on how he used it, he could really reveal deceptive abilities, but this space jump didn't have only an advantage all the time. Since he exhausted his mana and stamina together, excessive use of it caused a rapid loss of his combat power. For this reason, Stravadi always used space leaps based on his rational calculation. Accordingly, he didn't use his power 10 times in a row impulsively. Sargatanas opened all 5 horns and quickly turned west. The battlefield was now 6 kilometers away from him, and the strange rocks around him obstructed his vision, so he could not see the battlefield well. "Oh my God." He sighed, almost losing his mind. It was natural that he showed such a reaction, given that he dumped in the battlefield the Eastern Army of 2,000 soldiers who had attacked the northern part with him. It was a very shocking defeat to him. The power of the House of Mammon far exceeded his expectations. What should he do now? Should he fight to the end or save his life by letting Yong-ho's forces occupy the eastern area without any resistance? Sargatanas turned with a heavy heart. Then he looked at his father-in-law as well, his ally Stravadi, who already led him to the right way after they decided to join hands to defeat Yong-ho's forces. "He is strong. We cannot win with the method we have taken until now," Stravadi said calmly, as always. Even at this moment, Stravadi didn't stop thinking. He deduced from the battle the strength of the master of the House of Mammon and his dungeon spirits, and drew one conclusion. Father-in-law Stravadi nodded. With his back straight, he faced Sargatanas, who was in great confusion. He got his face closer to Sargatanas to say something important. He whispered in a calm voice, "Listen to me, Sargatanas." Sargatanas gulped. He just remained silent and listened to him respectively, as he did when his father-in-law led his army to break through the east and devastate the northern area. Then he opened his mouth and groaned. He looked at his father-in-law, putting his hand on his chest. Sargatanas had no time to be astonished by his action. Stravadi did not tolerate his resistance at all. The moment Sargatanas raised his head again, Stravadi busted his heart with one hand to the heart of Sargatanas in one hand. He screamed silently. Stravadi covered his mouth with the other hand. At the same time, he released mana as well as magic power that would never fall behind him. He even nullified Sargatanas' desperate struggle, who lost his heart before he knew it. Even though his heart was busted, this mighty demon king didn't die immediately. He glared at Stravadi with resentment and anger. He tried to squeeze his voice to say something, but Stravadi tightened his hand that covered his mouth. As always, he explained it calmly. Two of us, who are weak, can't deal with this strong man. Even if you and I join hands together, we can't defeat the House of Mammon. What we need right now is one absolutely strong man. We have to stop him with the dungeon-style fighting, not a battle like this. Sargatanas' eyes trembled, his body stiffened, and he quickly lost the warmth of his body. Goodbye, Sargatanas. It's sad for me to part with you like this. He was serious. It wasn't a lie. Stravadi carefully laid down the dead Sargatanas with his eyes open. After closing his eyes with the hand that covered his mouth, he sensed his dungeon spirits were coming to him. It seemed that all of them got out of the battlefield as he ordered. Everyone seemed to have left the battlefield as directed. Stravadi no longer talked sentimentally. He swallowed Sargatanas' essence. Chapter 170, Dungeon Breakthrough 1. It was an overwhelming victory for Yong-ho. The Mammon family's casualties were only about 30. On the other hand, nearly half of the Eastern Army soldiers lost their lives, and hundreds of those who survived were injured. Unlike Embryo's army, whose frontline commanders mostly survived, the command system of the Eastern Army was smashed. Therefore, there was no leadership for the defeated soldiers. Since they were completely shattered, they were no longer a threat. The battle was completely over. However, the battlefield was still full of vitality, because Yong-ho's forces were absorbed into capturing booty from the dead Eastern Army soldiers. The armaments of the Eastern Army soldiers, who gained wealth through their northern expedition, were quite excellent. It was clear that just recovering various armaments and armor would generate a considerable amount of money. Moreover, some of them possessed quite expensive items, but Yong-ho was not greedy for small things. He planned to distribute most of the items obtained from the battlefield to his rank-and-file soldiers. Actually, he had already made the announcement about it before the battle. He took the measure to raise the morale of the soldiers of the Free City, who were out on an expedition at his order. Fluttering its wings, Salami landed on the ground. Salami landed in front of the skull unit that maintained its ranks in an orderly fashion, even when other soldiers were to acquire the spoils of the battle. Bucephalus was the first to pretend to know Salami. Its face was soulful when it neighed cheerfully. It seemed to ask Salami something like, "Didn't you see me fighting well? Wasn't I cool?" Salami snorted, but only for a moment. Instead, Salami appreciated Bucephalus, its arch-rival and bad friend, with a pleasant smile. Skull, 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 the Knight of Death, who could now be said to be the pride of the Mammon family, expressed due respect to Yong-ho by erecting its hammer spear. When the 200 members of the Skull unit, who had yet to break their synchronization with the end of the battle, bowed to Yong-ho in unison, they created such a spectacular scene. Yong-ho was really happy. He seemed to know why it took so long for the principal to make a long speech whenever he took the podium when he was in elementary school. Hundreds of skulls fixed their eyes on him. He felt a great thrill at that moment. Behind his back, he heard Catalina flapping her ears and tail cheerfully. She was as much thrilled about the skull's spectacular greeting as he. Indeed, the shabby little house of Mammon on the verge of collapsing was the thing of the past. Just like Salami did, Yong-ho returned their greeting with a happy gaze. When they were done, Skull laughed heartily, as usual. Skull loosened his synchronization with his members that he had maintained during the battle and sat down on the ground comfortably. Man, they're back to their old selves. The 200 skulls, who behaved themselves so politely only a minute ago, were fully relaxed and began to wander around in place. Some of them sat down on the floor like Skull, or even rolled around on the floor. It seemed that it was not just their combat skills that were delivered through the synchronization. Yong-ho also lightly tapped his left chest to get out of the consciousness that had been gripping him throughout the battle. At the moment, He felt a tingling pain in his chest, but he soon felt comfortable. The heart of the demon god. Mammon's legacy, which was left behind in the human world, was not an ordinary brigada know-how on how to deal with greed was just redundant for him. The 7 fragments stuck in his left chest. The heart of the demon god was different from the godly energy of greed that was created through the 12 spirits of the House of Mammon. It was an object that existed for only one ritual, namely bringing the owner's spirit and body closer to the demon king. Of course, it wasn't permanent. It was just a temporary doping. But the effect was absolute. When one fragment was triggered, they called it one demon. When one demon was activated, one's consciousness started working since the fragment penetrated deep into the heart. Brigada's fragment directly stimulated the essence, which could be called the center of the mana, so that it could make the flow of mana stronger and faster. It forcibly opened up the potential of the body through insinuation, which would not normally be opened up. It was like overclocking a computer. It was also thanks to the activation of the demon that Yong-ho managed to create the green sun, although he couldn't have enough time to concentrate mana compared with when he did during his fight against Embryo. There were 7 fragments that made up the demon god's heart. Naturally, the stage of consciousness existed up to 7 demons. When the consciousness progressed one step further, it was supposed to increase the power, so it was hard to imagine how powerful it would be when all the 7 demons were fully released. Perhaps, as the name suggests, Yong-ho might reach the level of the demon god. Of course, it was dangerous. Even activating one demon exposed one's body to severe stress. Moreover, starting with the stage above 4 demons, the method of amplifying the power itself was not as simple as one demon. It demanded more than stimulating essence with Brigada. The reason why Yong-ho learned about the heart of the demon god even belatedly was because he made Kaiwan his dungeon spirit. He came to know roughly about its usage and danger through Mammon's remaining mana left in Brigada. Probably, it seemed to be a kind of artifact that wouldn't trigger at all if the owner's mana did not reach a certain level. It was indeed Mammon's way of securing his surrogate, which was consistent with many experiences Yong-ho went through until now. After deactivating one demon, Yong-ho faced the dungeon spirits more comfortably. The captured commanders are here. They are at your mercy, master. You can either grill them or kill them. Kaiwan unleashed one of the captured commanders that she dragged to the floor, bound by her whipsword. Then Eligos and Ophelia also laid down the eastern commanders they had carried or bound. All of them were in bad shape. Those with one of their arms or legs broken were the least injured, while most of them were severely wounded. In the battles of the demon world, especially the battles among the masters of houses, there were few cases in which prisoners were released for ransom. The masters could grow their power only when they took the essence of their opponents. Moreover, the death of the masters meant a sharp decline in their dungeon defense. Because of this, it was a big advantage for the winner to capture and kill them. Nevertheless, there were some reasons why the master of a house was taken as a prisoner. First, when he was highly valuable as hostages. Second, when the winner wanted to make him a subordinate. Third, when the winner wanted to gather information from him. The Eastern Masters, commanders taken as hostages, who fell on the ground, generally had 3 horns. They had 4 horns at most, but the level of their mana was the nascent 4. Since there was such a gap between the level of his mana and theirs, Yong-ho would not get much benefit even if he took their essence. It was for the second and third reasons that the Eastern Masters were captured alive. I will set up a temporary prison and torture room right now. Please allow me to take the task of interrogating them so they can leak everything about the Eastern area. I'll force them to confess anything they know, said Eligos with his eyes glaring sharply this time. Although his whole body was stained with the blood and flesh of his enemies, he seemed to be even more muscular and powerful than before. Catalina narrowed her eyebrows, and Yong-ho smiled bitterly. Though he witnessed it several times, he could not get used to the way Eligos enjoyed his hobby of tormenting their enemies. Well, let me give him a pass since he does it only occasionally. In fact, Eligos needed it. Since he didn't catch Stravati and Sargatanas, the heads of the Eastern Army, in this battle, he had to gather all the intelligence to prepare for the next battle. Even Ophelia made a horrible expression at Eligos' request, but Eligos was all smiles on his face and got ready to interrogate the captured Eastern commanders. Right at that moment, somebody shouted, "No, you don't have to interrogate us. One of the least injured among them opened his mouth. He was a master from the Nagaraja race that was said to have a snake's heart and tongue. I will tell you all. Let me tell you anything that you want to know, no matter what. He didn't say that because he was resigned to his miserable situation. There was resentment in his voice. Eligos urgently clenched his fist. How dare you try to trick us? Stravadi and Sargatanas abandoned us first. They betrayed us. The Nagaraja master shouted quickly. The resentment in his voice was not directed against Yong-ho, but Stravadi and Sargatanas. He was right. Stravadi and Sargatanas did not appear while the Eastern army was being annihilated. The Nagaraja master knew what their disappearance meant. It meant that the two leaders of the Eastern army fled after making them scapegoats on the battlefield without even fighting Yong-ho's forces. The Nagaraja master stared at Yong-ho desperately. Kaiwan, who was silent all along, stepped out to second his opinion. It doesn't sound like he is telling a lie. I don't think he has any reason to stay loyal to his bosses who ran away. I agree. Moreover, this guy is from the Nagaraja race that allegedly has a snake heart. It is unlikely that he will keep his loyalty when the Eastern army has collapsed, and he himself was betrayed by his bosses. Ophelia seconded this time. Then she made eyes at Yong-ho slightly, suggesting she was ready to test him if her master wanted. Catalina didn't say anything, but given that she flapped her ears and tail, she seemed to be on the same page with Kaiwan and Ophelia. All right. Let me listen to your story. Yong-ho gave him the go-ahead. The Nagaraja man let out a breath of relief, while Eligos became sullen, with his shoulders drooping.